and welcome to episode 503 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leeks. Damien, we are back. We had a break last week. We probably need to explain ourselves.
Yeah, so I apologise for my voice. There's the giveaway. So last week I completely lost my voice, and I think it's down to hay fever. So in recent months, interesting, I don't know if I've actually said this on the podcast, but long and short of it is that I'm allergic to silver birch tree pollen and dust mites and, funny enough, cats, which I never knew, given that I had a cat for so long, who anyone who listens to the podcast knows used to sleep on my chest at night. And I've now noticed that I get quite bad throat in the sort of early sort of summer, late spring, and that's what happened this time around. And my voice just kept getting croakier and croakier. And I was saying to Andy, I think I'm going to lose my voice by the end of the week. And then it went. I had a combination of Tottenham playing at home. I went to the semi-final. I think that then just finished me off. So by the time we got to Friday, I could barely speak. So apologies for the lack of podcast. So today on the show, I'm going to be croaky, but I'm going to try and get through it as best I can and as quickly as I can before my voice runs out.
Okay, with that in mind, let's preserve your voice then, Damien. Let's move straight on to what we've got coming up on this week's show.
So, usual three pieces. I'll be doing two of them. Andy, you'll be covering the third. So the first piece is in relation to prescription charges. It's something that's quite personal to me, given that I spent a fortune on them for my Crohn's. But we are also looking at something I think not many people know about in relation to ways of reducing your prescription charges. But for people who have HRT, so hormone replacement therapy, there's a way of massively reducing the cost of the drugs that you need to take. So we'll be covering that on the podcast. I'm also going to be doing an investment piece. So anybody who's been a member of 80/20 Investor over the years will know that I've been running a portfolio successfully for 10 years. So a decade has gone by. And what I want to do is just pull out some of the learnings from that, some tips on how I've managed to outperform the market over such an extended period of time, and not just the market, but professional fund managers as well. And then we're going to go on to the final piece, Andy, you're going to be covering is in relation to energy.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking energy bills again, specifically why right now, sort of late spring, May, June time, early summer, is the perfect time to look at your energy bills, look at your energy account, and work out whether you should actually contact your energy supplier and ask for a refund. I'll explain how that works. It's to do with the energy payment cycle. We did it last year. We're going to do an update for this year, and that'll be at the end of the podcast.
So those of you listening to the podcast, fortunate enough to live in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, you don't actually pay prescription charges. But in England, the current charge is £9.90 per item. Now, that obviously racks up if you have a chronic condition like I do, which means you have to take quite a few tablets or medicines over a period of time, but there are ways you can reduce the cost of it. So just to quickly backtrack, you don't normally pay for prescriptions, even in England, if they are administered in a hospital, if they're prescribed contraceptives, or they're certain sexually transmitted disease treatments, or medicines that are prescribed to treat things like tuberculosis and some mental health conditions. But for the majority of people, and as I said, including me, who has a chronic condition, I have to pay prescription charges. Now, there are some exclusions, so people under the age of 16 or over the age of 60 don't have to pay for prescriptions, and people in full-time education aged between 16 and 18. And if you're pregnant or had a baby in the last 12 months, you also don't need to pay for prescriptions. And if you or partner receives certain benefits, again, you don't need to pay for a prescription. Now, I'm going to put a link in the notes of this piece on the podcast so you can see the full rules on who pays and who doesn't. Now, for those people who do have to pay for medicines, then there is a way of reducing the cost over time. So the prepayment prescription certificate, the PPC, is a way of reducing the cost of your medicines. And the way it works, it covers all your NHS prescription charges for a set period of time. So if you have a certain number of prescriptions in that period of time, then it could be very cost effective. So a 3-month certificate costs £32.05. So this is cheaper than paying for just 4 or more prescriptions within that 3-month period. So if you have 4 items, that will come to £39.60. If you have a PPC certificate, then it only costs you £32.05, so saving you more than £7. You can also get a 12-month certificate that costs £114.50, and that gives you a saving if you need 12 or more prescriptions in a given year. So if you think about it, 12 times £9.90 is £118.80. Well, the 12-month PPC is £114.50, but if you need a lot more than 12 prescriptions in a 12-month period, the savings are significant. Interestingly, there is a way for women who are receiving hormone replacement therapy to get cheaper on the NHS via something called a prepayment prescription certificate. There is a special HRT version of it. On screen, I'm showing you a table that shows the potential savings that somebody who's prescribed HRT medicines could potentially make if they use the HRT prepayment prescription certificate. Now, it depends on what drugs you're on and how regularly your prescriptions are issued, so what cycle you're on if you have them monthly. But in an example that we've given, if you are in receipt of estrogen tablets, gels or patches and progesterone tablets, then you could potentially, if you have them monthly, save as much as £217.80. Now, I've mentioned it does depend on the cycle of your prescriptions and the drugs you're on, how much you could save, but it is significant, and a lot of people don't realise that it's available. I must stress that not all HRT medicines are covered by the prepayment certificate, so testosterone isn't. But you can check via a link which we're going to include in the notes of the show to see which medicines are covered. But the savings you could make are significant. The other thing to note with a prepayment certificate, you can backdate it up to a month from the point that you apply for it. And if you do, and you actually purchase some prescriptions during that month period before you actually applied, you can claim back those expenses as long as you do it within 3 months from the date in which you paid for the prescriptions yourself. You can apply for a prepayment prescription certificate online. We'll put a link to the full article on the Main Term Message website, so you can find all the details about how you can save on your prescriptions, how you can claim refunds, and how to apply for a PPC.
No, it's a really interesting piece, Damien. I'm glad we did it on the podcast, because I know from speaking to people in the office and friends, people aren't talking about this. So people aren't being even told by their local GPs. So it's good to get it out there, and it's an interesting piece. And there are details, as you say, in the show notes if people want to read more about how to apply for the specific PPCs. Okay, so let's move on to the next piece of the podcast then, and we're going to be doing an investing piece, Damien. It's been 10 years since you've been running your own portfolio for 80/20 members, and you're going to provide a bit of an update on what you've learned over those 10 years.
Yeah, so I've been running a portfolio for more than 10 years now. It was 10 years in March, and I've been running a portfolio successfully, very successfully. In fact, the 50k that I originally had, I still call it my 50k portfolio, but it's now worth more than £90,000, and it's at the point where it made in 10 years over 80% profit, which was a fantastic result. And if you want to give that some context, if you put that in the mixed investment 40 to 85% share sector, which is a multi-asset unit trust sector, the biggest one out there, and over the last 10 years it would have ranked about 35 out of 143 funds. So that would have put it in the top quartile of funds within that particular sector, and it would have meant that I actually outperformed, well, I did outperform managers that were running £51 billion worth of money for investors. So if they'd been listening to me or following what I do, they would have been far better off. But obviously I teach people how to invest, I don't run money personally. So when I was thinking about this, and the portfolio has been doing very well since the turmoil that we've had with Donald Trump, it's actually been slightly defensively positioned, and that's meant it's outperformed its peers, and it's up to 29 out of 143 funds if I use that comparison once again. And I thought, are there some quick lessons or things that I've done as I manage my portfolio over the years that could give some tips to people who are doing the same thing? So I'm going to run through them very quickly before my voice gives up. And so the first thing I want to point out is I run a portfolio that has a number of funds within it, and typically the number of holdings is somewhere between 10 and 14. It started off as 7. I tried to keep it as low as possible, but around about 10 to 12 is the norm. And that's deliberate, because if I keep a fairly concentrated portfolio, then it gives me a chance to outperform when I get things right. Equally, if I don't get things right, then it could underperform. But there is a point where the more funds you have, you start to dilute their impact. And also, it leads on to a point I always try to avoid having more than, say, 3 funds from a given sector. And there was some research I carried out for 80/20 investor members that proved that the more funds you have, and typically once you get above 3 to 4, then that portion of your portfolio, when you have 3 to 4 funds from the same sector, that portion just starts to really mirror the fund sector average for that particular sector, because you're just starting to have a larger exposure to funds that really start all doing the same thing. So you're better off knowing what funds do and why they're different. So when I pick a fund from the same sector, I try to limit the number down in my portfolio to maybe 2, 3 at most. But I also tend to look at what they invest in and try to make sure they're doing something different. So that means looking at the top 10 holdings they have. I look at the sectors that they're invested in, not just the companies, and try and see that I'm not just buying more of the same. So they do behave differently in different market conditions. The other thing that I tend to do is I don't tend to have more than a 5 to 15% allocation to any given fund. Normally it's between 5 and 10%, but the largest one I've got is about 15%. But I must stress the largest holdings tend to be towards the lower end of the risk spectrum, so something like a bond fund. But as I move up the risk levels, so I go towards a fund that might be slightly more high risk, then I tend to have between 5 and 10% exposure to it, more than likely 5%. So that means that my portfolio has that element of stability. And the biggest thing I think that I would give anybody who is running a portfolio as a tip is to have a process, whatever your process is, and stick to it. So I tend to favor using momentum investing. The 80/20 investor algorithm is built upon that, so it identifies trends that are forming in funds. So I tend to look for things that have a trend that's becoming established, and then I will look to incorporate that in my portfolio and remove ones that are starting to tail away. Now, by sticking to a process, it means I'm objective. I don't have a subjective biased view of anything. So I don't have a bias, which is, one of them is called endowment bias, where you start to favor things you already hold. As a tip, if you've got a portfolio of funds, and I say try to keep it fairly concentrated, if you decide you're going to review your portfolio, when you look at the funds that you hold, always look at them in an objective manner. And by that I mean, if you were looking at them today and you had the money to start from scratch, would you buy that fund? And if the answer is probably not, then that suggests that you probably shouldn't be holding it. So that means that you get rid of that bias of holding on to things just because they've done well in the past, and you're objective. Now, the other thing that I do, and I suggest others will benefit from, is remove anchoring bias. So that is the idea where you look at or consider the price you bought at. So if I buy a fund and I invest in it, I don't look at the price when I sell it and compare it to the price when I bought it, because the process that I'm using is looking at whether the fund is a good investment at that point in time. And so I will sell out of a fund with a loss. But ultimately, what matters is not that you make a poor decision or a fund doesn't perform. It could have been a fund that the decision was made for the very right reasons and things just suddenly changed. For example, we've had Trump recently causing chaos in the markets with his trade tariffs. You can't foresee a black swan of any kind, like a financial crisis, for example, or even something like Donald Trump and his trade tariffs. That can suddenly change the makeup of the investment landscape, and funds could suddenly underperform. But what I do is I will look at the fund objectively, and then I might remove it. And it may be that I've removed it and I've lost money, but the aim is, over the long term, is to get more right than you do wrong. And when you do get it right, the profit you make outweighs the losses you make on the ones that you get wrong. And if you stick to a process that has been proven over time to have success and outperform, then that is things like momentum investing, value investing, smaller companies investing. If you do it and apply it rigorously, then you are more than likely going to succeed over the long term. Now, I've mentioned holdings. A key one for me is gold. I always have at least 5% holding in gold. It can go up a little bit every now and then because of the performance has been so strong, but 5% is a good number. Research that I've carried out on 80/20 Investor suggests that once you get above 10%, then the volatility of gold's price starts to impact the volatility of your portfolio. And so some of the benefits of diversification start to be undone and you start to get a more volatile portfolio. So I tend to stick towards 5%. Also, when I buy funds, and I've mentioned already that I tend to try and buy funds that are doing things differently and not just the same if they come from the same sector, I also x-ray through that. So what that means is I look at the overall portfolio as a whole. So I look at the asset mix. I look at what the asset mix, maybe the percentage it's got in US equities, UK equities, what percentage it's got in UK bonds or global bonds. For the whole portfolio, I don't obsess about it on individual funds. I will look at it for individual funds if I'm making a change, because I might think, well, I want to keep my asset mix at a certain level in a particular asset, maybe UK equities. And if I get rid of a fund that had a large exposure to UK equities, then I'll be mindful that when I replace it, if I want to maintain that allocation to UK equities, I have to look for a fund that's got significant exposure to UK equities. So I always look under the bonnet. That's one thing I would say. The other thing that I've done over the 10 years is look at the risk of my profile overall. So I tend to have a low risk portion, a medium risk, and a high risk portion. Now, how you divvy that up in terms of, or determine what funds are low, medium, and high is up to you. But you can also use the fund fact sheets because they do give you a score on there of the risk profiles of different funds. And what I tend to do is aim for, but not stick to, having roughly about a third in the low risk end, about a third in the medium, and a third in the high risk. But as I flex, I tend to more than likely shift, so I'd have more in the medium risk if I reduce the high risk, or I might have a little bit more in the low risk. So what I tend to do is I don't become overweight in high risk funds. I want to keep my overall profile the same. So if I move a fund that's low risk and I switch it, I tend to switch it for another low risk, or I will make sure the portfolio somewhere else I get low risk funds in there. The other thing I would say is always look to do regular reviews. So how often do you review a portfolio? At least once a year, you should always do that. Now, I do it monthly because I obviously run 80/20 Investor and give commentary on how it's performing. But I do look at it, and often I won't do any changes to the portfolio. Now, I do tend to make a tweak most months, but that's because the fund that I've changed has probably been in the portfolio for 2 years. So I don't do the wide sweeping change of the whole portfolio. The way I tend to invest is more like I'm weeding a garden. So I'm pruning and just pulling out the weeds and largely letting it grow as it is. While some people might be tempted to wipe a portfolio clean if it starts to go wrong, then I think the problem with that is you can get caught on the wrong side of a market move. So I tend to prune. And one of the things I would suggest people do is that people often will drip into the market, and I do that. I move into a fund maybe in stages, but I move out of the fund in stages if I want to maybe reduce my exposure because the momentum's starting to fall. So do bear that in mind. It's not all or nothing, but don't use that as a reason to hold on to a fund longer than you need to. So if it's a fund that's being flagged by your process that says you might want to review its place, you've always got the option to reduce exposure, not just get rid of it completely, and see how that goes in stages. So I do sometimes do that. I do sometimes drip out of a fund. It's an option. When I'm looking at investment options as well, if I'm faced with two options and I'm not sure which one to pick, then I tend to go for the one that's got the lowest risk, so the one that's had the lowest weekly fall, for example. It's a stat that I tend to follow on 80/20 Investor. Or you could look at something like volatility and see which has been the least volatile over a given period of time. And I also tend to favour the cheapest to try and reduce the cost of my portfolio. The other thing I would tend to do, and it's something that's fared well over the years, is when volatility is high in a market, then I tend to do nothing. So I won't tend to make a change because the market can move against you very quickly. And you can find that you can sell out as the market's dropped 4% and then you buy back in when it's gone up 8% and then you've lost out. So I think when market volatility peaks, then I think it pays sometimes just to sit on your hands, because it's better to be right than first. So when a trend is unfolding, I like to be right and on it when it's actually more established, and rather than be the first person to invest in it. Leading on from that, when we get to market pivots, so I'm talking about points where the market may be at a high point and it looks like it's just suddenly turned and starting to fall, or equally we might be at a market low, then I think favouring index trackers has fared well over those periods. So by that I mean being less in active concentrated funds, because that works well when you've got an established trend in the market. Maybe you're going after technology stocks, but at the point that you get the pivot and the uncertainty, it seems to be favouring index trackers, because then what you do is you're getting what they call all that beta. You're just getting what the market's doing rather than being in the areas that are out of favour. But when the markets are moving in a certain direction, hopefully upwards, then being in slightly more active funds can work in your favour. And that's just an observation that I've noticed over the years. Now, I know that can be difficult to implement, but it's just an observation that I've made over the years, that when you're getting periods of uncertainty, kind of like we've got now actually, that sometimes being in wider, more diversified funds can help, because you don't know where the winners and losers are just yet, because the trends haven't unfolded. The other thing I would say is I don't tend to invest massively in multi-asset funds. I tend to invest in funds so I can control the exposure to assets myself. So I'll invest in maybe a bond fund, or I would invest in equity funds, maybe in the UK or the US. I might go for global funds because that helps with diversifying your equity mix. But what I mean is I don't tend to just buy equity bond funds, because I'd rather tailor that exposure. Because within bonds themselves, you could have high yield bonds, for example. And occasionally, sometimes cash does better than bonds. We've seen that a lot in recent years. So I like to sometimes tweak that and have cash within the portfolio as well. So I don't tend to invest in those multi-asset funds. I might have one in the portfolio, but I tend to try and do it myself and alter that mix as it goes along. And the final thing I would say is always try and learn what your portfolio is reacting to, where its strengths and weaknesses lie. So where I talked about I build a portfolio and look at the underlying funds and what's in them, sometimes just watching what it does when the market goes haywire. So you might have a news headline that happens, and it could be something in relation to Trump, for example, and his trade tariffs, and the market slumps or soars. Look at your portfolio and the individual holdings and see how they react, because they can give you more information, that detail about what's really driving your portfolio. And then even when markets settle down, you can use that information to better diversify your portfolio going forward. And I don't think people teach people enough of that. Watching your portfolio, seeing what it does, doesn't mean you have to make a change, but you might see, for example, that when bond markets tumbled, a particular fund might do particularly well, and that's really useful when you've got something like a targeted absolute return fund. So a fund where it's not obvious how it invests, it's very useful to see what's driving that. So that's a roundup with some of the lessons and tips that I've got to pass on from running a portfolio over the last 10 years live in the public domain. And it'll be things that I'll wish I'd said and forgotten about or whatever, but I'll bring them to the podcast in the future, because there's always things that you can always learn when you're running a portfolio.
Okay, so let's move on to the final piece of the podcast then. We're going to be talking about energy, and specifically why now is a really good time. So sort of late spring, early summer, it's a good time to check your energy account, see how much you're in credit, because there's a chance that you could ask for a bit of a refund back, and I'll explain why that is. It's essentially all to do with what's called the energy cycle. Now, the energy cycle is where your energy account balance goes up and then goes down again throughout the year. And that's based on the fact that your amount of energy that you use each month fluctuates across the year. But of course, what the energy companies do is they set a fixed regular direct debit for you to pay each month, because that makes things easier for you to budget. And over the year, it should even itself out. So in order to understand how that works, I'll quickly go through that cycle. So in winter, it's cold, the heating's on full blast, you're almost certainly using more energy than you're paying for. That fixed energy amount you're paying each month, let's say it's £100, you might well be using up to £120, £150 of energy in that month. And that will happen throughout the winter months. You effectively go into energy debt. Then in summer, say June to August, your energy patterns start to shift slightly because, of course, you're using your heating less, you're perhaps in your house less, and of course, you've got the longer days, so you're not using your lights as much. And so what will tend to happen then is you start paying down some of that debt and going into credit, energy credit. And then spring and autumn, those are the bits in between the winter and summer cycles. These are the transition times. So in spring, your energy usage drops, so your debt stops growing. And then in autumn, your energy usage starts to increase. And so that energy credit that you've built up starts to be chipped away at. So you can see it swings up and down. And for those that are watching Spotify or YouTube, you can see the image on screen there. It fluctuates up and down as the year goes on. So how much credit is too much credit? And when should you be asking for a refund? You do need to be careful about when you started your energy account with your supplier, because if you started in that winter period, you haven't had that summer period to build up your credit. So do be careful on when you started. But a good rule of thumb, if at this time of year, around about May, June, you've got more than 1 month's fixed direct debit sitting in your account as credit, there could be an option there to ask for a refund. I personally would err on the side of caution and bump that up to 2 months, because you don't really want to be asking for money back only to then get to that winter period and then you haven't covered enough credit and you start going into more energy debt. So be careful before you sort of act on this one. Now, one thing to be mindful of is you do need to make sure that the meter readings that are being supplied to your energy supplier are accurate. So that means either you making accurate, up-to-date meter readings to ensure that everything is as it should be, or obviously if you've got a smart meter, make sure that that smart meter is providing the right readings to your energy supplier. So if you're, like I say, more than a couple of months in credit at this point, because this is where you start ramping up and building lots more credit throughout the summer, then possibly you could ask your supplier for a refund. And so it's relatively easy to contact your supplier and ask for a refund. We'll put the specific details on how to do that within the show notes. We've got an article that explains that in some detail. Now, while you are entitled to a refund, there are a few exceptional circumstances where a supplier might refuse. They need to give you a good reason as to why they've done that. And if you think that refusal is unfair, you can complain formally, first to the supplier, and then if that fails, you can take that to the energy ombudsman as well. Just a few quick words of warning at the end of this piece before I bring you back in, Damien. Things to look out for before you start asking for a refund. Remember that winter is coming. We're moving into that summer period. Obviously, everyone's excited for the sun, but don't forget the winter period always comes. In the words of Game of Thrones, winter is always coming.
Did you see me laugh? Because I was trying to hold it together. Anyone on the podcast who's watching this on Spotify would have seen me start to smirk like a sort of schoolboy when you said winter is coming. But yes, you're right, Andy, winter is coming.
So the most common reason that suppliers advise keeping the credit in your account is to cover those higher winter bills. So a supplier might deem your request for a refund unfit because of the amount of credit you've built, bearing in mind winter is coming. Also double check to see if your direct debit is actually right in the first place. If it's too low, then asking for a refund now will only lead you into trouble further down the line. Remember, estimates are not really the way to go forward on this. Make sure that the readings you're supplying or that your smart meter is given is accurate, because if it's based on estimates, then the maths all falls apart. And if you are due to switch soon, or you think you might be switching soon, I wouldn't really consider asking for a refund, because part of the switching process, your old supplier is obliged to give you a refund if you've still got a credit in your account when you switch, and it should be done automatically within 10 days of working out your final bill. So if you're switching, don't bother doing this. The money will return to you naturally anyway. So Damien, there we go. The energy cycle explained. If you're sitting on loads of credit at this time of year, that's possibly a point where you might want to ask for a bit of a refund.
I think that's a fantastic piece, Andy, because it is difficult for people to understand when they're looking at their bills whether they are in credit, but not really in credit, if that makes sense. If they effectively haven't built up enough of a buffer for the winter periods in the future. And I think there's a good rule of thumb to look at this time of year, because you are going to start ramping up your buffer that you're building because you're going to use less energy in the summer. Now's the point at which you are at that stage where you're going to see that, well, the buffer you've already got in there, if it's too much, then it's unnecessary because you're going to be building on top of that. I do think that it's always good to engage with your energy bills anyway, not just talking about how much you spend, but how much you have on your account. And I find it frustrating, particularly with the energy provider that I use, that they charge you monthly but bill you quarterly. So even though I have a smart meter and I can see how much I'm spending a day, if I go into the account online, the balance that's online is not taking into account what I'm spending each day. So, for example, I'm due to come to end of a quarter in May. It's still showing a balance and it hasn't actually taken out money for the energy that I've used in April and February, for example. So that balance you're seeing there, do bear that in mind. You need to work out, is your provider doing the same as mine? And mine is the biggest in the UK, just to give you a hint. So if you are with one of the biggest providers, it may be that you have to do a bit of maths, look at what you've used, look at what your readings were and how much you've used in the last couple of months, deduct that from the amount that it's saying you've got in credit on your account, and then see, is that more than 1 or 2 months worth of my direct debits? And then you could sit there and think about maybe it's worth getting a refund of that amount of money. Nothing's ever simple with energy, Andy. It's a fantastic piece. As ever, that is it on the podcast this week. So I would say please do leave a review, send them in. Do write them on your podcast app of choice. I'll look at Apple's podcast app and read out a couple of reviews in the next couple of weeks and give away a Money to the Masses mug. So even if you don't listen to it over there, go over there and write a review anyway. Don't forget to follow us on all our socials. That's Instagram, TikTok. Obviously, follow us on our Facebook group. It's facebook.com/groups/Money to the Masses, and our YouTube channel. There's so much content going on all of those different channels that if you just listen to the podcast, you're missing out, I would say, on about 90% of what we do. And also, it goes without saying, the Money to the Masses website as well. So, Andy, I think I've covered most things. So that means all that's left for me to do is say, until next time.
Until next time.